Next item on the agenda is to conduct a public hearing and consider a request for the amendment to the Allen Land Development Code, Section 6.06.11, solar panels. At this time, we have Assistant Director, Mr. Battle, to present the case.
Thank you, Chair. Good evening, Commissioners. This item is a proposed amendment to the Allen Land Development Code regarding requirements for solar panels. Some of you may remember or were on the Commission back in 2012 when we initially adopted requirements for solar panels. At that time, we didn't have anything at all in our ordinance, and there was an increasing interest in installing them in the city, and so we went through the process to develop that set of requirements that is in the ordinance today. And that's been in place since that time. So for about the past 4 years, we've been operating under that initial set of rules regarding installation of solar panels. Since that time, of course, the technology evolves, the energy industry and the market has evolved a little bit. The economic feasibility has changed some, so different things are continuing to change as it relates to solar panels. And we had a group of residents slash solar panel advocates, some installers that approached the city and requested that we take a look again at the ordinance and consider making some revisions specifically to lessen some of the restrictions as it relates to these installations in order to provide more opportunities for residents and others that want to install these. And so we did review the ordinance, came up with some recommendations. We did go to the City Council at one of their workshops and present information to them, received their input on what elements they thought were ready to be modified, and they give us direction to put together an ordinance amendment and bring it forward. And so here we are this evening with these set of recommendations regarding amending the ordinance. I would point out that normally when we do this, you get kind of a marked up version that's all redlined. In this case, we were making enough changes that it made sense to just kind of wholesale replace this section of the code. And so you have kind of the existing section in front of you and then the proposed section in its entirety for comparison instead of trying to mark it all up and make it, make sense for you. So, so you have that. You will notice that we are removing quite a bit from the code. It's about 1.5 pages originally. Now it's down to about maybe 2/3 of a page. So we were able to streamline many elements of the code through the process. And anytime we can actually make the code smaller, it's a great thing for all of us. But a lot of that is stuff that we found is either redundant of other code provisions. Some of it's kind of covered by the building code, so we didn't need to have it in here. Some of it is elements that just we don't think needs to be in there at all based on our experience over the last 4 years. So we were able to take some of the application and code reference elements out of this and really shrink it and make it more streamlined. So moving straight into the requirements. First, I want to point out that the solar panels are permitted by right in all zoning districts in the city of Allen. That's the way it is today. We would continue it to be that way. So they are considered to be an accessory use permitted in any district. So you could install one anywhere in any zoning district in the city of Allen. The only thing that's required is that you apply for and receive a building permit. We do have an application and a separate checklist, plan review checklist specifically for solar panel installations. So it is, from a process perspective, the application is very straightforward, very streamlined, about as simple as we can make it in terms of getting that permit. There's no SUPs. Some cities have done SUPs. There are not anything like that in our code. It's go down to the building counter, submit your application, get it reviewed, and get your building permit. We think that's a positive in terms of helping these get installed. And we have seen a fairly steady stream of these, and especially over the last year or so, a little bit of an increase in the number of these that we're seeing installed in the community. So we know that they are coming here. There's a lot of interest, and they are being installed. Moving to the next section, this moves more into where on the site itself solar panels and equipment can be installed. And I want to start with rooftop installations specifically. So A says that you can install on both the primary structure and accessory structures that are on the property. This is a little bit of an expansion because currently it's limited to the primary structure itself. but we recognize there are also opportunities for them to be placed on patio covers or other buildings that may be on the property. It's a good opportunity and may be appropriate. This picture down here in the corner kind of shows a patio cover that's, I think, a great installation. So we widened that to provide those opportunities. B is a provision that's in the ordinance today that solar panels shall not be placed on a roof that directly faces the public street. This is an element, again, that's been in there and is really an attempt to mitigate potential aesthetic concerns of the solar panels. This is probably the one element of this ordinance that we've received the most comments about on both sides. There are some advocates that really would like to see that removed to increase the area and the locations that are available for the installation of solar panels. And you know, recognizing that where we are geographically, having solar panels face the south is how you get the most efficient system overall. And so if you have a house that faces south, it may impact the efficiency of your system or what you can and can't do, depending on your overall roof structure and what else is going on. So, you know, that is one of the concerns that's been voiced. We've also received concerns related to the aesthetics and specifically a desire to leave this provision in there because there are concerns about how they look, and if it was across the street from somebody and they had to look at it every day, how it might affect their value of their property and also, you know, their quality of life if they have to look at it. So both of those are probably legitimate concerns just coming from different perspectives. And so what we've tried to do with the ordinance is put in place something that provides balance, mitigates some of the concerns of the aesthetics, but allows them in multiple places on the property so that there are opportunities to install solar panels. I would point out it doesn't say can't be visible from the public street, because that really gets cumbersome in terms of what's visible and what's not, but it really is the slope of the roofs that actually directly face the street is where they would be restricted. So that's how it's written, and that's how we've been implementing it over the last 4 years as well. So C is a requirement that it be parallel to the roof, and that just means it can't be kind of cantilevered up. That creates concerns both in terms of wind load and aesthetics as well. So keeping the solar panels kind of that same slope as the roof is the intent there. And then D is finally for flat roofs. It's pretty straightforward, but if you have a flat roof, it can be on there, and we treat it basically like we do other mechanical equipment. It has to be screened by a parapet wall. Can extend above the actual height of the zoning district by about 10 feet as an extension, but that's pretty much it for flat roofs. Moving on to the next section, this is ground-mounted installations, and this is also a new element in the code. Previously, it was limited to roofs, but we recognize that there may be ways to install them on the ground in people's yards that make sense as well, and so we wanted to provide for that opportunity with basically two simple requirements. The first one is that you meet the applicable setbacks, so that means as an accessory structure, it's not going to be allowed in the front yard. It has to be behind the front building line, so you're talking backyards and possibly some side yards. And secondly, that it be separated from view by a solid fence. This really just means it needs to be fenced in. And that's for a couple of reasons. One is, again, to provide a little bit of an aesthetic barrier. So if there was no fence around the yard at all and you had some of this equipment there, it would be highly visible. And then also an additional layer maybe of safety and security for this type of equipment. And so there are some examples here on the screen, common examples of how this might be done. You see these kind of lean-to looking examples. Again, what this code would requires that these installations are okay, but there be a fence across there to limit the visibility. And again, it's not trying to make it invisible, because we recognize if you have an 8-foot wooden fence but a 12-foot tall structure in the back, you may see it sticking up, and that's not the intent, is to make it completely invisible, but to mitigate maybe some of that impact. And then they may also be pole mounted, so there's an example of one that's also mounted on a pole. Those are just some of the more common ways that you might do a ground mounted solar installation. And then finally, a couple of other additional requirements that are in there. You'll note that we specifically reference the 2015 building code and the 2015 fire code And that's because they have specific language that addresses roof coverage and spacing, so that if a firefighter has to get on the roof and walk, there's space. The reason we've included this is because currently we're still on the 2009 building codes. We're working toward adopting the 2015, but we haven't got there yet. And so we wanted to just fill that gap. There aren't really very good provisions in the 2009 code. So we've specifically called out those provisions in the 2015 code. We hope to adopt that whole set of codes by the end of the year, in which case this will, it would be covered by that anyways. But just to get us until we adopt the 2015 building codes, we needed to put this provision in here. Number 2 is related to glare. And this is really language that just helps us address an issue should it occur. We don't really anticipate this is not a problem that happens very often. We haven't occurred this kind of problem yet, but in doing research, it's less likely, but it's not impossible that something could be situated in a way that creates reflection or glare that it becomes a nuisance. We know the panels are designed to minimize reflectivity, but there is a possibility of it happening, and we just want to have the ability, anytime we adopt rules, we think about the ultimate enforcement that we may have to do should a problem occur, and we just want to have the tools in place to be able to do that. It's not one of those things we're going to go around looking for, but we want to be able to address it if it comes up. Really the same thing with maintenance. As they're installed and stay up there over time, they will be subject to maintenance and wear and tear and everything else that, just like anything else you install at your house over time, it has the potential to deteriorate. Most people take good care of their stuff, and a handful of people, we have to encourage them to do so, and we need the tools in place to be able to do that. We also from time to time have situations like a vacant house or an abandoned house where we have to deal with things, and again, we just want to have those tools for enforcement in place. So that's really what those elements are intended to do. We did receive comments, and you do have from the public, and you do have those in front of you. I would also point out, I think some of those comments reference, and you may hear some more about it tonight, but the North Central Texas COG has been working through a process to develop kind of a model ordinance with some best practices in it. The draft came out just a couple of weeks ago, and so we've been looking at that. Like most of the things that come out from COG, they have the challenge of trying to create something that fits the region, and not everybody's going to like every piece of it. So, but they do a good job of coming up with some guidelines. I've read through it. I think overall it's pretty good. But as we do with most things that are a model ordinance, there are pieces of it that we like and adopt, and some pieces of it that just don't fit our community and we leave out. So, and that'll be the case with this as well. It's still in draft format and receiving comments and all, so it's not even a final document, but it is referenced. So I wanted you to know about it. And then finally, we do also always look around at the other cities and see what they're doing. And in our research, we found a variety of ordinances in our adjacent cities. Some cities at one end are very hands-off. They really rely on their building codes and perhaps some of the other language they have in place for accessory structures, and they don't have specific language related to solar panels. I believe Plano and McKinney are both like that, pretty minimal regulation. Some cities do have some elements in their land development code that address some specific requirements of these installations, such as we do. And so we see some cities that have that. Going back again to the issue that we've heard the most comment about, the front-facing solar panels, we would be in the minority in having that regulation. We wouldn't be the only ones. There looks like Carrollton has some language that limits that. Rowlett has some language. Melissa has some language. So there are a handful of cities that do, in some ways, have a similar restriction on front-facing solar panels. But a minority of them are not doing that now. But again, we've tried to put in place and bring forward what we think is an ordinance that meets the interests of our community, provides that balance. And so that's what we have here this evening. And with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions that you have.
Any questions for staff before we open the public hearing?
I have a question, Lee.
Yes, ma'am.
On, of course, this section 6.06.11 down in B3 under maintenance, that last sentence, the solar panels that are not in use shall be disengaged so as to prevent accidental electrical charges to property or persons. How are we as a city making sure that that's being done?
Yeah, again, that's not something we would proactively go and do, but if we knew that a piece of property was vacated and we were having to deal with issues there, they would give us the tool to be able to address that, to either enforce whoever's in control of the property to do that, or ultimately deal with it ourselves if we had to. So not something we intend to do every time somebody's moving in and out of a house, but if we find a situation where something is abandoned or vacant for a period of time, we don't want it sitting out there being a potential hazard.
So we have no way to regulate that as a city, right? Is that what you're saying, unless we know about it?
Well, correct, right. We
Okay.
would not regulate if we didn't know about it, or we wouldn't enforce it, I should say, if we didn't know about it.
Yes, sir.
Couple of questions, Lee. When we say something is permitted by right, does that can a homeowners association restrict it?
Okay, that's a great question. So, homeowner CC&Rs or deed restrictions are really an independent set of rules and regulations from city ordinances. In this particular case, the state has passed legislation that significantly limits what HOAs can do with regards to solar panels. So, the language is a little complicated in state law, but basically it makes it almost impossible for HOAs to limit the placement of solar panels on residential properties.
That's true today.
That's true today.
Okay. Okay, clarification on the roof facing the public street. Is that limited to only the front roof, front elevation, or does it include back and sides?
Just the front.
So homes that back up to, as an example, Exchange, their back is in Exchange.
Okay, no, directly facing is the language that's in there. So any roof slope that's directly facing,
Whether it's the front of the house, the back of the house,
straight.
or the side of the house.
right.
Okay.
So it's not intended to just be the front of the house. It's intended to be the
Okay.
side of the house that faces the street. And we recognize there's some level of subjectivity and interpretation that's required there. So
And the last one, just clarify what I heard. For a non-roof mounted one, if they put it in their side yard, backyard, it needs to be enclosed by a fence. But if I understood you right, the fence is not required to be as high as the unit. It could be
that's correct.
so it could be a unit that's set up 10 feet, and it could be a 6-foot fence under it.
That's correct.
Okay.
But a solid fence,
Solid.
not a tubular,
Not a,
has to
not
be
a-
solid.
Not a
some
wrought
sort
iron
of-
fence, right.
Basically treating pole-mounted or backyard as an accessory use. It just has to be screened by a normal 6-foot privacy
Some
fence.
type of fence, that's correct.
Is it required to be a 6-foot?
It's not required to be 6 foot. It's
Could be a
just a
2-foot.
solid fence. So,
It could be a 2-foot. It's a solid fence.
Thank you.
One question I did have, just after reading it on Friday, driving around the neighborhood, and noticed that several neighbors in the neighborhood, they had the circular airflow, circulation for your roof, the larger one, not the chef hat, what I call it, but the mushroom-looking ones. They had a ton of those mounted on top of that circular airflow deal. And I know a majority of the ones that we've seen are the square, rectangular on a roof. Is there any measure that you can think of where we need to say, you can't have those on top of the circular deals? I mean, is that something that we foresee? Because
So-
most of it is what you pictured, but
Sure.
I've seen different uses of it.
sure. So the smaller applications where in that case you have kind of a fan in there that's solar powered would be similar to you have garden lights that have a little solar panel. So if you look in the definitions that we've created for solar, which aren't in here because we're not changing them, they exempt those smaller applications from these regulations. So they're not covered by this.
Okay. And then second, do we limit the footprint or coverage of a roof to where if you have a perfectly square rectangular roof, you can just throw as many as 100 if you wanted to on that roof? Or is it cannot exceed 20% of the roof, 50, 70? Has that ever been a thought? Like you can put as much as you want on there?
Yeah, so the ordinance today actually has a percentage in it, but we're moving away from that relying on the building and fire codes, which instead of a percentage, they say you have to be a certain distance from the ridge, from the edge, from the valleys. And so that, in it de facto, limits the percent coverage and allows accessibility.
Okay. And then final question, sorry. On one of the pictures, you have a A-frame to where the roof shingles are technically not facing the street, but they're facing this way, and you have the facade.
Mm-hmm.
Is that allowed to where it's on the sides, not facing?
Sure.
But
So, yeah, well, I'll say this because every roof is different. And since we've been doing this for a few years now, we have a system in place where we evaluate each roof to determine, what meets the intent of this ordinance. And so the plans examiner and actually myself have looked at many of these. And if it is, let's say it's the side of the house.
and you had a picture here.
Right.
If you want to scroll back, I know I'm speaking with my
and so-
hands. This one here to the bottom left, if
Right.
they were to face it on the roof sidelines that you can't see on there,
So generally,
facing, so.
generally, the way we've applied it, and again, we look at each one carefully and discuss it and make a decision as a staff. But, anything over here is facing the side, anything over here is facing the side. Any of these we consider to be in the front of the house.
Okay, so you would allow, though, the solar panels to be on the peaks right there?
We would on these and these, but probably not these because that entire piece is the front of the house. So,
Okay. I'm done. All right.
Other questions for staff before the public hearing?
yes, sir.
Further clarifying the facing, if you're on the corner lot, the secondary street, would that be considered,
It would be
or
considered,
would be omitted also?
yes, sir.
Okay.
And alleys are not considered public streets.
That's correct.
I guess back to John's question, if you have a house that backs up to a road and the back of your house just happens to have a clear shot to the road, that doesn't count. It's the frontage road, the municipal address road,
It would,
that's
well,
where you're considering the front.
not necessarily, it would be a public street. So if it was, if your property was facing that street, then the way it's written out, it would count. So,
Wow.
Yeah.
So it could be the front and the back.
So
Okay,
if
I
you've
got
got a house that's on a
Could be.
corner, the facing street on the back, you'd have three sides that you would not be able to put solar cells on.
Okay, and the happen chance.
Yeah.
Okay.
That, that's, if you go through the town, it's probably,
They have them, yeah.
it happens in subdivisions, but it's a small
Okay.
number, but it is a reality of the rule to the nth degree in one direction.
yeah, it is undoubtedly a challenge. And again, if our intent is to try to have some balance where we do allow solar panels, but we at the same time want to mitigate concerns about, maybe how they look, it would be impossible to put in code language to probably fit every potential, roof design scenario. And so we put the cleanest language that we can in the ordinance, recognizing that we're going to have to make interpretations going forward to try to meet the intent of that code, so.
I have one more. Just follow up on the HOA. Isn't there like an association of HOAs or something like that? Where
Not in the city of Valens. Some cities do, but we do not
we
have.
don't have it. The city doesn't have any relationship with a group of HOAs.
There's not any kind of an organized grouping of them.
I
That's
was just
correct.
going to ask if you had solicited any input from HOAs on
Not specific.
the cons of this.
We have a handful of management companies that we talk to, and I do believe we did receive one set of comments there from someone who's both a resident and on an HOA board that expressed their concerns about the visibility issues. So, but in this case, since HOAs are not really allowed to regulate them, we didn't consult them directly on this particular issue. It's really up to us to decide what we want to put in our ordinance.
I think they're probably busy with our backyard chicken ordinance recently. So,
Well, Lee, I think you've done a fantastic job
Well-
working with the groups and researching all this.
Appreciate it.
Good job.
And just going back to the HOA is a self-imposed set of regulations that the city is not involved with, but it's self-imposed. It creates its own regulating body. And so it is independent of the city. The city ordinances sit on top of the HOAs. And I say, in other words, the city laws are laws for the entire city, but the HOAs can do their own rules and regs behind the scenes without any input or involvement from the city whatsoever. That's their own private area.
I understand that, but I think that they can, if
They
they wanted to.
used to be able to control solar cells. It was a multi-year fight on the Texas legislative, but that was done in the last legislative body, was the removal of that. They changed the rules that makes it much harder for HOAs to restrict it. But that wasn't an easy one. I think that went up for consideration for 5 or 6 years in different
2 or
forms or
3
fashion.
terms, yeah.
Any other questions for staff before we open the public hearing? Okay, at this time, we will open the public hearing.